Well, good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, or good morning, as the case may be. On behalf of the Department of Celtic Languages and Literatures, I want to extend a warm welcome to you all, wherever you may be. It is a beautiful October afternoon here in Harvard, and I wish you were all with us for today's 17th John Kelleher Lecture. I want to start with heartfelt thanks to those who have made today's lecture possible. First of all, to the benefactors of the Kelleher Lecture Fund, and to Professor Emeritus Patrick Ford, who established that fund and initiated this lecture series. I want to thank Mary Violet, the administrator of the Celtic department, who's overseen all of the preparations for today's event, and Luke, the tech, who is watching over us right now and keeping everything running smoothly. But most especially, I want to thank Ruaidhrí O'Higgins, who was to have been our Kelleher lecturer in 2020, an occasion that was lost to the pandemic, and who has graciously agreed to deliver a lecture this year when circumstances still prevent us from gathering as we would like to here at Harvard. John Kelleher, as many of you know, was a distinguished scholar and a legendary teacher in many areas of Irish studies, ranging from early sagas to James Joyce, and from the annals and kinglists all the way down to the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921 and beyond. John graduated from Dartmouth College and came to Harvard as a junior fellow in 1940. Except for his years of service in Washington during the Second World War, John remained at Harvard until his retirement in 1986. In inviting our Kelleher lecturers, we always try to seek out speakers whose range and depth of scholarship is worthy of John Kelleher's legacy. And our lecturer today certainly meets that standard. As a graduate student, I never failed to be amazed at John Kelleher's ability to develop compelling narratives of the rise and fall of dynasties and the machinations of their learned supporters from king lists and genealogies. So, like all of you, I look forward to Rory's deployment of his vast learning across the field of early Irish studies in his lecture today, where it appears that those genealogies will make an appearance. So I will now turn the spotlight over to my colleague, Joseph Nagy, the Shattuck Professor of Irish Studies, who will introduce our speaker.
Joseph, you just need to unmute yourself. It should be popping up. Perfect.
Thank you, Katharine. Already thank you to our speaker. The presenter of the John Kelleher Lecture today, as you have just heard, is Dr. Ruaidhrí O'Higgins, a senior professor in and the director of the School of Celtic Studies at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. The title of his presentation is Ancestors, Gods, and Genealogies. Having received his doctorate at Queen's University, Belfast in 1989, Dr. O'Higgins went on to teach in Uppsala, Bonn, Galway, and Belfast. That is, at his alma mater, Queen's University, where he became head of the Celtic department. Accepting the offer of the professorship in modern Irish, he moved to the National University of Ireland, Maynooth, where he became head of the School of Celtic Studies. Now he is at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. In addition to his numerous articles in all the major Celtic journals and his many contributions to just about every outstanding collection of studies in Irish and/or Celtic published over the last 30 years, several of which he himself edited or co-edited, Professor O'Higgin has also edited the first two massive volumes of a relatively new series from the Royal Irish Academy, featuring cutting-edge scholarship on the contents and history of the major Irish manuscripts. Although his record of publications extends throughout the various phases of the history of the Irish language and both its literary and oral tradition, I, no doubt like many of us here, think of particular works of Professor O'Higgin's that I return to again and again to be renewed and refreshed. For example, his article on the background and development to the Táin Bó Cúailnge in the volume Aspects of the Táin, edited by J.P. Mallory, his wonderful article on the various Ferguses in and behind the Ulster cycle that was published in the journal Imania, and a piece that was published in the James Carney Festschrift that has to do with what was considered an archaism in the Irish heroic saga rhetoric that in fact Professor O'Higgin takes a very revisionist view of, the phrase being, "I swear by the God my people swear by." So in conclusion, and before I pass you on into very capable hands, I would like to take that phrase and adapt it a little bit here and say that I swear by Rory O'Higgin that we are in for a very edifying as well as a very entertaining time. Rory, take it away.
Right. Thank you very kindly, Professor Nagy, for that very kind introduction. I didn't recognize myself there. I'd like also to thank Professor McKenna and Professor Sumner for the kind invitation to give this lecture in honor of John Kelleher. It is indeed a great honor, and I'm delighted to be with you, if only virtually. Now, I have to start by confessing that I never met John Kelleher. I heard him lecture at a Tillhole of the School of Celtic Studies, the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies, many years ago, and was also present in 1999 at the International Congress of Celtic Studies in Cork, when he was conferred with an honorary doctorate of the National University of Ireland, and where his friend, former student and colleague, Professor Sean O'Quillan, paid him a very warm and elegant tribute as scholar, mentor, and as person. My own acquaintanceship with John Kelleher has therefore been through his writings, several of which I've consulted with profit and have had a bearing on my own work. Now, one area in which John Kelleher made a significant contribution to our field was in his study of various aspects of the medieval Irish annals and genealogies. The annals, historical records of events in medieval Irish society, have attracted the attention of many and naturally have formed the bedrock of countless historical studies, as well as being the subject of scholarly research as texts in their own right. The main collections have long been edited and translated, some more than once, and most are now online and are searchable. While they doubtless have much more to reveal and will continue to require much more study, as accessible primary source texts, they are not in a bad place. Genealogies, on the other hand, have proved to be more forbidding and have enticed a much smaller cohort of scholars. In the strictest sense, genealogies are the pedigrees and lines of descent of important Irish dynasties and families, of which there are many, and the surviving body of Irish genealogies is very extensive, dwarfing corresponding collections from other Western European traditions. Therein lies the nub of the matter. For their sheer extent, comprising thousands upon thousands of personal names, nearly all of them male, by the way, the problems inherent in trying to unravel various interlinked strands of descent, the challenge of reconciling differing genealogical accounts, and the keen-eyed vigilance required to detect error, be that in omission or duplication, or indeed to spot willful forgery, have proved to be challenges that have deterred all but the most intrepid. We're fortunate, however, that most of those who've been drawn into their orbit have been scholars of the highest caliber, and much of the work they've done, be that in editing tracts or in explicating their contents, has stood the test of time and have laid the solid foundations on which future research will be built. Yet, compared to the annals, the study of the genealogies is still in its infancy, and given the relative lack of attention they have received, I'm going to share my screen with you now if I can. Sorry, the host has disabled participant screen sharing. Could somebody put that right? I'm trying to share my screen. Can somebody help me here?
Yeah, I'm seeing if I can change that setting for you. Sorry. 1 second.
Okay. So what's the weather like in Boston?
It's a beautiful day, I started to say, but was muted. It is clouding up. It's a lovely sunshiny day, warm. It's perfect for October. Wish you were here.
Oh yeah, well, it's a bit dull and overcast here, but it's not bad. It's dry at least.
Luke, what if we made Rory a co-host? Wouldn't that work?
Mary, can you do that? Yeah.
I can, yes.
I was
I
trying
see
to
the
do it
make
myself.
co-host.
Perfect, thank you.
Yes, sure.
All right, Rory, try now.
Okay, don't worry.
Good, okay.
Did that allow it?
I'll give it a try. Ah, yes, this seems to be.
Perfect.
Are we all right there?
Yep.
Right. Okay. Right. So, compared to the annals, the study of the genealogies is yet in its infancy, and given the relative lack of attention they've received, it's perhaps no wonder that Nollaig Murrayla's recent introductory booklet on the subject, The Irish Genealogies, has the subtitle Irish History's Poor Relation. And by the way, this is a study booklet I recommend very highly to you. And this is, he phrased it so, for in contrast to the annals, many of our surviving genealogical tracts have not yet been edited, let alone translated and analysed. Despite this relative lack of attention, the importance and indeed the pervasive importance of genealogy in Irish tradition cannot be overstated. A simple indicator of this is afforded us by the fact that most of the earliest surviving manuscripts written in Irish contain vast swathes of genealogical material. This is certainly true of the 12th century Rawlinson B 502, now found at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, the Book of Leinster, found in Trinity College, Dublin. We skipped the 13th century, for which we have no manuscripts. When we take it up again, we have the O'Kionnan Miscellany in the National Library of Ireland, and Lukas O'Dallaghan's collection of genealogies from the middle of the 14th century, written in South Galway. And then we go on to the great Connacht codexes compiled later in that century, the Book of Iwana in the Royal Irish Academy, a few leaves in the British Library, the Book of Ballymote, and the great Book of Lecan. By my rough estimation, genealogical tracts account for between 25% and 35% of each of the last three mentioned compilations. And when we consider that each of these manuscripts is now incomplete and gapped, especially the Book of Iwana, we realize that their genealogical content may originally have been considerably more extensive. The rough figures I have given in percentages relate solely to the tabular genealogical tracts in the manuscript. Those long lists of names, the published form of which have been characterized by John Kelleher as having all the charm of an obsolete telephone directory from some remote capital. And in mentioning a telephone directory, I realize there may be people listening who've never seen such an object, but such are the times move on. This first slide, just illustrating what Kelleher said, is from the book of Lecan, from the book of Ballymote, and the next one is from the book of Lecan. And these tables list pedigrees from son to father, to grandfather, to great-grandfather, and so on, tracing lines of descent to common ancestors, showing how various different families and septs are related, and at which nodes in the genealogical tree they're joined. But extensive though these tables may be, and they are, the actual genealogical content of our manuscripts is far greater, for many of them also contain narratives that serve to elucidate or expand crucial nodes in the genealogical tree. Thus, the tale Achtra Vedon, found in the book of Ballymote, for instance, is the origin legend of the Néill, the O'Neills, the dominant power in the northern half of Ireland for much of the early medieval period. The legend of Seanachas Airgialla, the legend story of the three Culles, explains how their affiliates, the Airgialla, how they originated and how they got land. Conall Cork and the Corcolaide tells of the early history of peoples in Munster, while the short tract edited by Vernon Hull, also of Harvard many years ago, Cuinn of Connacht, explains how the people called the Ciarige arrived in Connacht. Jacau's Torchi Corcha Ocha describes how the people called the Corcha Ocha ended up in County Limerick and also in South Ulster. And we have several versions of the story of the expulsion of the Zeisha, a people found in Southeast Ireland, in Waterford, and also in County Meath, explaining how they came to be in different places and the relationship between them. So these origin legends that we find in the genealogical tracts help to explain or expand important points there. Many of these genealogical compilations, moreover, are interspersed with poetry or with snippets of narrative, extolling the exploits of significant ancestral figures, be they secular rulers or saints, or recapitulating some of the information presented in the genealogies themselves. And the tentacles of genealogical tradition extend even further, as I presently hope to show. Now, taking a broader look at this obsession, one could almost say, in genealogy, we find that this interest in genealogy and in origins can be seen as part of a wider national project that was concerned with the origins and history of the Irish themselves. This project had at its goal to establish for Ireland a place among the nations of Christendom, a place not accorded them by the Old Testament. Through the labours of numerous generations of scholars, an Irish national legend was forged and grown as they grafted an Irish branch onto the tree of world history as depicted in the Bible. Texts such as the Sexitates Mundi or the Leabhar Gabhála explain the lines of descent from the Irish, from Japhet, the son of Noah, through a series of invasions and invaders and various different settlements, through a figure called Gwyddon Glas, and eventually to Néill Espáine, the ancestor of all the Irish. So we follow a line from Japhet, or Yafet is called, to Gwyddon Glas. Gwyddon is the person who is supposed to have invented the Gaelic language from the languages of Babel, and then to Míle Spáine, Miles Hispaniae, the ancestor of the Irish. And the tradition of the Leabhar Gabhála counts 5 invasions before the Irish come. Some die due to plague, others die or defeated by the subsequent invaders, and so on. So we go down through this list of various prehistoric, semi-biblical ancestors until we arrive in Ireland and we have the native ancestral figures. But behind the line, the Milesian line, as it's called, the line from Míle Spáine, we have other peoples lurking in the background who didn't quite go away. One of the most important of these were the people called the Fir Wallog. A number of theories about their name. It's been suggested by T.F. O'Reilly rather ingeniously that it may be a reflex of the name of the Belgae, the Celtic tribe on the continent and in the south of Britain, and also the Tuatha Dé Danann. And these figures emerge in our genealogies as well, as we'll see later on. So this enterprise had to do with creating a history, creating a past for Ireland, and one in which they used a variety of materials: biblical history, antique learning, mythology, dynastic propaganda, inherited, perhaps oral traditions, and pure fiction. Not only that, but they used the landscape itself. They used prehistoric edifices like the megaliths at the megalithic tombs at Newgrange or in the Boyne Valley, Tara, and Navan Fort in Armagh. These are constructions, man-made constructions, prehistoric constructions that had nothing to do with the Gaels or the Irish, but they were used, they were taken and put to use again. And the landscape itself was also used, because certain of these figures, ancestral figures, are taken from toponyms, from place names, and the place through the Irish process of what we call dinhanachas, the lore of places, whereby an already existing place name can be utilized, a personal name extracted from it, and then a legend spun around this. And the fact that the place exists, in a sense, attests to the veracity of the legend that the framer is trying to put forward. So this is the background to it. And then we move to the native ancestral figures and into Irish society, early Irish society. And when we look at early Irish society, our history starts with the advent of Christianity, officially in the 5th century, but Christianity probably arrived sometime before that. And we find a mixture of peoples. We find what we can call wider population groups. Some people refer to them as ethnonyms, but that may have certain connotations that I wouldn't like to use. So larger population groups such as the Ullas, the people of Ulster, or the Lagan, the people of Leinster, the Éireann, a very interesting population group or peoples found throughout Munster in the southern part of Ireland. Éireann seems to reflect the old name Iverni, or a version of which was found on Ptolemy's map, written about 150 AD. And this seems to be the name by which Ireland was known. People like the Galleon, or other people like the Dubhnin, found in various different places in County Dublin, in County Kildare, and also in the far reaches of the west in County Mayo. And the name of these people, the Dubhnin, can hardly be divorced from the Celtic peoples found in southwest Scotland and southwest Britain, the Damnonii or the Dumnonii, leaving their name in Devon. And this seems to be the remnant of an earlier people who came and settled in Ireland and perhaps fragmented into smaller groups. And then we have the Connachta. Then we have the unit referred to as the tuatha. The word is tuath. I'll come to this in a moment. As the basic unit, the basic political unit of Irish society, of which we have very many throughout Ireland. And then later on, we find what we call septs, bodies of people coming from a named ancestor, like the Néill, the Ivrún, the Iachroch, the Ichenchellach, and people like this. So this past that was being formed for Ireland, the upshot of this was that any lord, any person could trace his origins back through a wide variety of people, back to Japheth, back to Noah, and into the world of the Old Testament. Now, I've used the term national to designate this learned enterprise. But when I do so, we should understand it as in a cultural rather than in a political sense. For when we look at our earliest written sources for medieval Ireland, we find we're not dealing with a unitary kingdom, much less anything approaching a nation in the modern sense of the word, but with a mosaic of smaller petty kingdoms dispersed throughout the land. While we find a high degree of linguistic and cultural unity, and doubtless there were regional differences in this, we don't find a centralized monarchy, although it is possible that such may have been in existence immediately prior to our earliest written records. And I should say that although Christianity comes in the 4th, 5th century, our written records, we have written records from the 5th century, mainly the writings of St. Patrick, but it's later on that these begin to increase in number, and we find ourselves on firmer ground. So we have these different peoples, but then we go to the smaller, the basic group of society, the tuath, or the plural tuatha. Each tuath, and this term has been sometimes translated by some people as tribe, but the term is contested because of, I suppose, pejorative connotations associated with it. So let's call it a population unit. And we find very many of these tuatha throughout the country. The names are formed by a number of different formations. We find the ending rige, which seems to have meant kingdom. It's connected with the word ri, king. We find in names, and I'll give you some names here that have survived, that are still used. They've transferred, the names of tribes have transferred to the population, have transferred to the territory occupied by that group, that population group. So Ciarige survives in the name of Kerry. Ossorige survives in the Ossory. Muskrige is Muskerry in West Cork. Dartrige is Dartry in South Monaghan. Partrige, Partry in South Mayo. And Callerige is Callery in Sligo. We also find constructions or formations ending in what seems to be a collective suffix here, ne or na, such as the Convacnamara, the Convacma of the sea, which leave their name in Connemara, or Laharna, the people of Lahar or Loher, which survives in the place named Larne, north of Belfast, or Delvna survives in the barony of Delvin in the Midlands of Ireland in County Westmeath. Or we get other formations such as Corca, as in Corca-Rivne, now the Dingle Peninsula, but formerly taking in the neighbouring Ivra Peninsula as well, or Corcamodrua, Corcamroe in County Clare, or Corcoria, Corkery in County Westmeath. Or we get the word Shiel, Shiel meaning the seed, the progeny of, Shiel Néill, Shilela, or Shiel Mran, Shelburne, or Shiel Molir, Shelmalir, and so on. Now, how this political landscape of very many tuatha came into being, we cannot say. It's been estimated that at any given time in the early medieval period, there may have been up to 150 of these tuatha in the country. But how their origins are obscure. Most seem to be informed in the prehistoric period, but others may have been formed later. Some of the names we can etymologize. The first element in the Riga series sometimes is the name of an animal, as in Usriga, us being a deer, or in Dartriga, the word Dart being a heifer. But others defy explanation. The name Partriga, for instance, Partry, is immediately questionable, or raises questions, I should say, because it begins with a P, and we normally would not expect Irish names to begin with a P, but many of them are obscure. One interesting feature of this landscape, and an important one, is that we find that peoples bearing the same name can be found in different parts of Ireland. Such dispersal may be due in some cases to the fragmentation of a larger population unit. In others, it may be due to migration and settlement. We know, for instance, that during the early period, Irish peoples settled in Britain. We have the evidence of the colonization by the Ailill and the Déise of southwest Britain and South Wales, the colonization of the Lagan, the Leinstermen of North Wales, and of course the Dal Riada, who went from County Antrim over to Scotland, bringing with them the Gaelic language. So just as we have external migration like that, it's quite possible that we had a degree of internal migration as well. In the earlier part of the historical period, the medieval period, between the 6th, say, and the 10th centuries, the evidence points to an increase in population in Ireland. This, strangely enough, but interesting enough, may be put down in part to the introduction of Christianity. Christianity brought to Ireland not just a new religion, but also a new technology, writing, a new understanding of law, canon law, an understanding of history and biblical history, but and architecture and art. But it also seems to have had a considerable influence on agriculture and on agricultural technology, on cereal growing, on milling, and so on. A lot of the terms we have are borrowed from Latin, as my colleague Liam Branagh has shown in a recent lecture. So this suggests that improvement in technology, improvement in arable crops and in cereal growing aided the increase in the population. And to this period, of course, are dated many of the ring forts settlements we find in Ireland. But these beneficial developments would also have been partly offset by natural calamities. The Justinian plague came to Ireland in the 540s, and the outbreak of another devastating epidemic is recorded in 664, causing multiple deaths. Between these two outbreaks, we have the period known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age. Now, these would not have been good for population growth. And how exactly events such as these affected the political landscape, we cannot say with certainty. An increase in population would have led, of course, to a demand for land and for expansion, while natural calamities such as disease or famine or adverse climatic conditions would have weakened peoples of less resources and may have made them susceptible to colonization and subjugation. The upshot of this is that the political landscape was dynamic and not static, and always subject to change. Larger kingdoms becoming fragmented and sometimes disappearing, while new dynasties arose. One of the major tendencies we note is a movement away in the course of the centuries from smaller population units, the tuaths, which we mentioned earlier on, to larger power blocks. And when we look at the annals, indeed, we find that not too many tuatha are mentioned there. And where they are, we cannot always be certain if reference is being made to the tua as a population unit, or if the name has transferred to the territory they once occupied, as is the case in the names I've shown you here. So if these tuath names are not too frequently encouraged in the annals, then what are sources of information for them? Well, to a great extent, our answer here lies in the genealogies, for the genealogists present us with a layer of history not found in the annals. These latter texts were more concerned with the ruling septs or dynasties of their own day than the records of people whose importance had diminished and had ceased to be significant players on the political playing field. The information the genealogies provide about the pedigrees and distribution of peoples who do not merit a mention in the annals is immense. Early Irish society, as we know, was highly stratified and hierarchical, a situation reflected in the laws which legislate for the status of individuals from king down to serf. In similar fashion, our genealogical tracts distinguish between peoples of different status according to whether they were sire, noble, or dair, servile, or unfree. So we find sire tuatha, which means something like noble or free peoples. The term for tuatha seems to mean a people who live in the territory of a dominant people, but who are not related to them, by blood. They don't have the same genealogy or lines of descent, but they still have rights and privileges. And the forstlinse means something similar. But then we have the dair tuatha. Dair tuatha means something like servile peoples. And at the very bottom, we have the atach tuatha. The word atach meaning a churl, a rent pair, a person pretty much of the lowest status. Now, the manner in which a population group might have become servile is unclear, but one might reasonably assume it would come about through loss of status due to conquest and subsequent subordination to their conquerors. So this dynamic political landscape we're talking about would have resulted as new dynasties rose, would have resulted perhaps in the subjugation of earlier dynasties. Dynasties are people, earlier peoples who once had status, but now found themselves in reduced circumstances. These, by the way, if you're interested, are listed, most of the names are in Edmund Hogan's Onomasticon Hibernicum. And I mention this because some years ago, the late Doncho Cuinn presented us in the Dublin Institute with an electronic corrected version, or with many additions and corrections. It's available on our website and can be downloaded. And if you're interested in a discussion of these names and different name types, still the basic study here is that of Owen McNeill, his study of early Irish population groups in the proceedings of the Royal Irish Academy. So, ignoring the distant ancestral figures from the Bible or the divine figures from Irish literature, how reliable are the genealogies as a record? Now, in dealing with any medieval Irish text that purports to relate events that happened in the distant past, we can accept as a possibility that the text does indeed contain material that is old. It is also probable that such texts contain much that is fictional, but very often these compositions will have far more to tell us about the time in which they were composed and the concerns, political or otherwise, their authors may have had. And this is the point very well made by John Kelleher. The genealogies don't differ in this respect. although our earliest collections are found in manuscripts of the 12th century or later, they can be shown to contain much material that is older than the date of the manuscript in which they're found. Some of the narrative passages, for instance, embodied in the genealogies are clearly written in Old Irish, and some in quite an early form of it, perhaps earlier than the 8th century. However, some of the information they contain may be inaccurate due to the nature of their transmission. As John Kelleher has shown, generations sometimes can be skipped and they don't sync with the evidence of the annals, for instance. And the further you go back, the less reliable they come. But these are the normal problems of transmission. However, Kelleher has also argued that the early genealogies bear the sign of being remolded, perhaps in the 8th century and subsequently, to reflect the dominant political power of the 8th and subsequent centuries in the northern part of Ireland, the Néill or the O'Neills. Now we must remember the importance of the genealogies was that any lord could trace his pedigree back through the ages, back to the world of the Bible. This also conferred on him his legitimacy, his right to rule. So it was very, very important that this be all in order. And in order to get it to chime with the narrative a lord might want to give, let's say somebody who had just taken lordship by dint of force, they would employ their literary people to change or to forge or to manufacture genealogies for them. So if we look at the main groups of peoples in Ireland, they all go back to a fictitious ancestor, a semi-divine ancestor. In the northern part of Ireland, we have the people called the Cuinn. These comprise the Connachta, the Néill, Bréifne and Airgialla. I'll show you this in a map in a moment. We have the Lagan, which take in the Leinstermen and their affiliates, the Connacht of Munster, who go back to a person called Owen Mór, and the Ullad of Ulster, who go back to a person called Rodrige. The Cuinn go back to a figure called Clonmacnoise, Cuinn of the 100 Battles, while the Lagan go back to Lavrid Lungship, Lavrid the exile. But in early medieval Ireland, the most important people were the Néill. The Néill belonged to the grouping called Cuinn, or I write with GC sometimes. These descended from Clonmacnoise, Cuinn of the 100 Battles, through a person called Néill Néill of the 9 Hostages, and his brothers Bréifne, Fiachra and Ailill. Interesting, the name Britain seems to be a borrowing from British. This people became dominant in the northern half of Ireland. And in becoming dominant, they displaced the Ullad and other people. They dominate Connacht and 3 branches of them, the Ivrion, descendants of Brian, the Ifiachra, descendants of Fiachra, and the Ailill, descendants of Ailill, dominate that western province. So this is a map I've taken from Francis John Burns' Irish Kings and High Kings, and gives you an idea of the political makeup of Ireland around 800 AD. And here we see the Néill, the 2 branches, the north and the south. The Airgialla are affiliates of the Néill. They are their genealogies join higher up the node, but they are a buffer state of the Néill, and then down into Connacht, where the 3 brothers of Néill Néill held reign. So we see that most of the northern half of Ireland was dominated by these people. Only over here in the northeast do we find the Ullad. And these probably were the people most affected by the rise of the kingdom of the Néill. They lost their territory and ended up in an area roughly coterminous with the modern counties of Antrim and Down, with a little piece of the north of Louth. But we know that they formerly claimed sway over much of the northern part of Ireland, where according to tradition, they ruled the territory from the mouth of the Boyne, the River Boyne, here, to the mouth of the Drowse in Donegal. Their traditions are celebrated in the body of literature known as the Ulster cycle, which recalls a time in which their dominance through Ireland was firm, or through much of Ireland was firm. In its written form, this body of literature must have been committed to vellum in one of the monastic scriptoria, the monasteries which lay in their control. And some of the most important monasteries lay in their control, such as Bangor in County Down, at one time Armagh, a centre of learning, Moville, Louth, and others as well. Drumsnot, the locus of the famous lost manuscript, the Cín Drumsneachta in County Monaghan. This body of literature was highly influential and was worked into the national narrative, chronicling, as they claimed to do, events in Ireland around the time of Christ. Of further importance, though, was the fact that several of the heroes of this cycle are cast as ancestors of people, not only in Ulster, but throughout other parts of Ireland as well. So the Ullad, the people of Ulster, are sometimes referred to as the Clonmacnoise, the offspring of Rudrige. Rudrige is cast as an ancestor, the ancestor of all the Ulster people, but it possibly originated as a place name. It looked suspiciously like a tribal name ending in Rige, and we have a number of places, including Loch Rudrige, Dundrum Bay, the Bay of the Rudrige, in County Down. This may have been a name of the people if we compare the construction to Ciarige, Osrige, Musrige, and so on. These, as I said, were the ancestor of the Ullad, and quite importantly, they're assigned to the Fir Bolg. Now, if you remember, when we spoke about the different peoples of Ireland, most of the people came from the Milesians, but the Ullad belonged to this rather sinister race called the Fir Bolg. But they were displaced in the north and the west by the Dáil, the Néill, and their affiliates. Now, this body of literature has furnished us with a number of ancestors, divine ancestors, we might say, who are the progenitors of dynasties in different parts of Ireland. People such as Fergus mac Ro, Conall Carnach, Conchor mac Nessa, Kelter mac Ithacar, and various other. These are people who populate the pages of early Irish sagas, but they also have a role in the genealogies and sometimes a very prominent role. And the ancestry of many peoples in Ireland were traced to figures from this body of tales. The four here, but there were others as well. How this played out in the genealogical record is interesting. And in the remaining time I have now, I would like to explore an aspect of how the tentacles of genealogy and genealogical tradition are wrapped around some literary texts and how they interact. And to do this, I want to look at the province of Connacht, which I mentioned to you before. The province of Connacht in the west of Ireland, as I've said, came to be dominated by the brothers of Néill of the Nine Hostages. There were three dynasties, the Ailill, the Éireach, and the Bréifne, reputedly descendants of three brothers of Néill who came to possess most of the western province. In the earlier period, the province of Connacht from the Ulster cycle was known as the province of Medb and Ailill, but became dominated by the Dáil. But within this province, we find many subject peoples. And by subject peoples, we mean probably people who were there before and who had lost their status due to the incursions of the Néill. The map here, it's not the visuals aren't the best, but I hope you can make out. We see the three main, the Brún, the Ailill, the Fiachruch, in large print. Various different branches of these people extend throughout Connacht. And in the south, we have the Iwana who were related to the Airgialla, excuse me, in the north, affiliates of the Néill. But when we look in the lower level, in the small print here, we find an extensive stratum of subordinate peoples. And it seems fair to say that these were people who had lost out to the expanding invaders from the north, whose subject peoples they'd now become. Some of these peoples are mentioned in earlier sources. Several appear in Tíorchán's 7th century material concerning St. Patrick, and are in other sources as well. Of these people, the most important were the people called the Cearige, of which we have at least 3 branches in Connacht. They're also found in Munster and in other parts, found quite widespreadly in Ulster. Another subordinate people are the Clonmacnoise. And there are others as well who are widespread and dispersed in Connacht, but who obviously had been a unitary people before being fragmented with the rise of the Dáil Cuinn. That they were of higher standing prior to this, we have some other evidence. For instance, many of the churches, or several of the churches, the important churches which served Connacht, such as Clonmacnoise and Clonfert, were founded by people associated with these Athaltuatha, or these lower people, or people who are now lower people. And from our point of view, what's interesting here is that many of these subordinate people claim descent from the ancient people of Ulster through the ancestral figure of one of their heroes, namely Fergus mac Ro. Now, Fergus and Yoshi mentioned a study, a general study I made many years ago, appears in many tales of the Ulster cycle. His name, it means something like manly vigor, son of great horse, suggests a divine origin, and he lives up to it. He's formerly a king of Ulster, but desires a woman called Ness, and she agrees to his advances, provided she grant her son a kingship for 1 year, her son named Conchobar. This he does, but it proves to be a ruse, and he loses the kingship of Ulster forever. At a later stage, Conchobar desires a newly born infant girl, of whom it's foretold she'll become very beautiful, but she will also be a femme fatale and bring about the destruction of much of Ulster. He has her set aside until she's of marriageable age, but before he can marry her, she falls in love with another person called Néill and forces him, or makes him, elope with her to Scotland. The enraged Conchobar is none too happy about this, and Néill and Deirdre suffer great difficulty in Scotland. However, the Ulstermen, realizing that Néill, who was greatly loved, was not responsible for this, strike a deal with Conchobar that they will be allowed back provided he goes guarantee for them. He does so, but no sooner are they back than he has Néill and his brothers killed, and Deirdre commits suicide. This is the story known sometimes as the Deirdre story, also edited by Vernon Hull of Harvard. As a result of this, Fergus goes into exile to Connacht, where he joins with Medb and Ailill, the king and queen of Connacht, and there he has an illicit relationship with Maeve. A version of the story tells us that he was there as a guest of Maeve, and one day her husband, Ailill, was out walking and observed a hazel tree shaking violently, and went over to investigate. And when he looked up into the depths of the tree, there he found his beloved wife and their guest. And well, I'll leave the rest to your imagination. But in any case, as a result of this encounter in the tree, Maeve gives birth to triplets or to sextuplets, who subsequently become progenitors of people. This story, this legend, is a very old one. It's found in a genealogical poem beginning Connacht Medb Míchora. Medb enjoins bad contracts, found in the law genealogies and maybe dates to the 7th or 8th centuries. It's found in the Deirdre story and several others as well. But this is a story designed to explain how a certain peoples in Connacht came to claim affinity with the Ulster people, and how this embodies a genealogical legend. So this narrative was composed to explain why certain people in the south and west of Ireland were related to the Ulstermen. The 6 children were Mugtaith, or otherwise known as Kier, who is the ancestor of the Ciarige, people of Connacht and Munster, also of the Clonmacnoise and the Bibhrige. And the other children of this liaison give rise to other dynasties in different parts of Ireland, where Fergus is cast as the ancestor. Now, among the people who claim such an origin were the Ciarige and the Clonmacnoise, 2 of the most extensive subordinate peoples in Connacht, but also several of the Connacht Athachtúatha, the servile people, also claimed this origin. From these people, it will be remembered, came the abbots of Clonmacnoise, for instance, a leading centre of learning and a location that was central to the transmission of the Ulster cycle of tales. The people, the abbots, and those who ran this and other monasteries would have doubtless been interested in material about their ancestor, material found in the tales of the Ulster cycle, which were being written and redacted in their scriptoria. However, interest in the legendary history of Connacht didn't cease there. Didn't cease in Clonmacnoise. In the late 12th century, Clonmacnoise fell into, lost its status and importance, having been attacked and destroyed several times. An attack in 1178 being extremely detrimental to the monastery, and thereafter the locus of literary endeavour moves from there. But we find that Fergus comes to be a figure and features in a number of other tales that date from a slightly later period. In the later medieval period, the people we call we knew as the Ivroon, descendants of Bréifne, a branch of them called the Crohur, the O'Connors, became dominant and dominated most of North Connacht and a lot of South Connacht. With their cadet branches, the MacDermots and the MacDonaghs, they were to dominate Gaelic Connacht for several centuries. Now, apart from the resources and their military might, this family sought aggrandizement through support of the church, and that they or their subsidiary branches funded the construction of many ecclesiastical foundations: Abbey Knockmoy, Boyle Abbey, Tuam Priory, Ballintubber Abbey, Cong, Roscommon Abbey, and many more and they became involved in ecclesiastical politics. They were also patrons of the arts and literature. They were patrons of the 4 traditional branches of learning, medicine, law, history and poetry, and in particular of history. Under the patronage of the O'Connors and their affiliates, Connacht was to become a leading centre of literary activity in the late Middle Ages. And learned families such as the Néill Chunra and the O'Dignans, the Bréifne, were the leading writers and historians of the period. In fact, if you look to the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, North Connacht in the O'Connor territory, or the territory ruled by their affiliates, was the main workshop of literary endeavour. And we find a number of tales, of later tales, written about in which Fergus Mac Ro plays a role. But in these tales, he's no longer the great hero of the Ulster cycle. He is a figure of derision and mockery, nowhere more so than in the late Ia a tale I would date probably to maybe to the 13th century, and the later version of Táinbro Flidisha, with which it's related. These tales cast Fergus as a weak and vacillating figure, a figure who is bought by Medb and is kept as a kept man. He complies with the Irish legal term a fer for ban tinachor, a man kept by a woman's wealth, a kept man. And these tales depict him in this light. Now, at this time, the redaction of this literature was in the hands of people under the patronage of the O'Connors and their affiliates, people who had come through a different route, genealogical route, than the Athathuatha, or the subjugated peoples of Connacht. And this seems to be, if you like, a genealogical joke, laughing at the ancestors of so many of the people who were losing their status, but were still in existence. Gradually, of course, the Ciarige and the Clonmacnoise disappear from importance and from view. The Clonmacnoise leave their name in the place name Connemara. And Fergus Mac Ro doesn't quite die out. For another branch of the family was in County Clare, in the barony of Kirkham Row and in the Burren. And as late as the 18th century, we find a collection of poems and genealogical texts collected by Andreas MacCritin for a member of the O'Loughlin family around 1728, containing much material associated with the O'Loughlin family. For O'Loughlin came from Fergus Mac Ro, containing poetry and other material associated with them. So to conclude then, genealogy is all pervasive in early Irish, not just in its tabular form, but also in the form of narratives, of poems, of tales, where the figures play a role in the genealogies. It was of central importance to those who framed these tales and who wrote them. And there were far, far more than lists. Ancestors, after all, were important, and your right to your legitimacy to rule was determined by your genealogical trees. And hence the importance of these in Irish literature and the importance of origins in general cannot be overstated. And we thank John Kelleher and other people who have worked on the genealogies, and there's much more to do, for pointing us in this direction. So I thank you for your attention. Go to Míle Maithagah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ruairí, for a fantastic and thought-provoking and absolutely jam-packed lecture. that I'm sure will occupy our minds for some time. There are traditionally no questions after the Kelleher Lecture, and we're going to hold to that tradition today. And we are so sorry that we can't be all together to enjoy a nice reception after this and chat. But hopefully we'll all get the opportunity to congratulate you in person on a wonderful, wonderful lecture and chat about ancestors, gods, and genealogies with you at some other point. So I want to, as we close, encourage everyone here, thank everyone here for coming, and encourage you to attend the Harvard Celtic Colloquium happening over the next few days, starting bright and early tomorrow. If you haven't registered, I'm putting the page for this year's Harvard Celtic Colloquium into the chat there for you. So please do join us over the next few days for a Harvard Celtic Colloquium. And thank you again so much, Rory, for your wonderful lecture. And I know that I may be the only clapping you see, but everyone here is clapping as well.
And you should, Rory, look in the chat to see all of the thank you messages that are appearing.
Oh, right. Thank you all very much. It was a great pleasure and a great honor, as I said. Pity I could have been there with you and you could have taken me to task for some of my heresies. But in any case, it's been a terrible time for us all, for students in particular, and I think we all look forward to brighter and better days ahead.
We absolutely do. We absolutely do. Well, folks, that's it for us. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you.
That was wonderful.
It's wonderful.
Okay, listen, thank you. I mean, I wasn't quite sure of my timing, so I was, but in any case, it seemed to go okay, and I got Kelleher in there a few times, which was important, and he was very inspirational. All right. So listen, thank you all. I hope to join. Sorry, I'll be traveling tomorrow. I'll be go down to Ciaruga, to Kerry. So I probably missed the first day. I missed Greg Darman's paper, I think, he's talking about Fergus MacLeod. I'd have loved to have heard that, but I'll get it again sometime, no doubt.
Well, thanks again, Rory, and have a safe trip down to Ciaruga tomorrow, and
yes, indeed, yeah,
a nice restful weekend after this, and we'll hope that we can get you over to be with us next year.
Oh well, yeah, yes, and I hope to see you all in the not too distant future.
Yeah.
As Yoji is mute, he's Yoji.
I hope you have a good night's sleep.
Yes, I think I will. I'll take something to help me.
Well, we'd have bought you something to help you were you here. So you'll have to come join us.
Sometime in the near future, I hope. Yeah.
Yes, for sure. All right.
All right.
Okay.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
thanks again.
Good night.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Luke.
Yes.